4:35 hours, October 26th, 1944. The waters east of Luzon were black and cold, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath before a storm. Lieutenant Commander Renji Sato stood on the pitching deck of carrier Amagi, watching deck crews move like ghosts beneath the faint blue of battle lanterns. The engines of the first strike were warming up their vibrations, rolling through the steel beneath his boots. He said nothing. Everyone knew this launch was different. They weren't flying to win, they were flying to disappear. From horizon to horizon, the Pacific stretched indifferent and endless. Somewhere beyond that line waited the American fleet carriers, cruisers, destroyers, a wall of steel bristling with radar-guided fire and proximity fuses that could turn air itself into shrapnel. Sato's air group was barely a shadow of what the Imperial Navy once was: patched machines, half-trained pilots, and the ghosts of victories long gone. The radio chatter was clipped mechanical, almost ritualistic. There was no strategy left, only obedience. He tightened his gloves and glanced toward the east, where the faint glow of dawn threatened to reveal them. The order would come in seconds: launch. Beyond that moment lay nothing but fire. The wind rose across the deck, scattering loose papers into the dark. For the men waiting inside their cockpits, this was not courage, it was surrender carried out with discipline. The signal flag dropped, the engine screamed, the last breath of a dying fleet roared into the sky. The command came without ceremony, just a sharp wave from the flight officer and the red lamp blinking to green. Lieutenant Commander Renji Sato didn't flinch. He had already made peace with what this meant. There was no time left for reflection or regret. He moved fluid and deliberate toward his Zero, parked near the edge of the flight deck, its skin streaked with patches and hastily repaired panels. A ground crewman nodded to him, eyes hollow, face unreadable. The men on deck didn't look at each other anymore. There was nothing to say. Everyone knew this wasn't a sortie. It was a final act in a war already lost. The engines of the first wave were rumbling, now casting rhythmic vibrations across the hull of the Amagi, blending with the thunder of the sea slamming into her flanks. In the dim red light, crews loaded what few remaining bombs and torpedoes they had. Some of the weapons were outdated, their fuses unreliable, their casings corroded by salt. Others were hand-modified, forced into working condition by maintenance crews who hadn't slept in 2 days. A mechanic cursed under his breath as he fumbled with a frayed ignition wire. Nearby, a teenager barely old enough to shave tried to climb into a cockpit, trembling as he pulled on his harness. These weren't pilots. They were remnants stitched together from hope, desperation, and orders written by men who would never sit in the cockpit. Renji climbed into his seat, strapping in with methodical precision. The cockpit canopy was stiff, almost jammed. He forced it shut and stared out at the dark horizon, now blooming with the first edge of sunrise. Behind his aircraft, the deck crews pulled chocks and rolled clear. The takeoff path was lit by lanterns taped to the deck. The electrical system had failed earlier that week and was never repaired. The Amagi herself was barely afloat, leaking oil and fuel, unable to generate enough steam to launch her own air group without assistance from tugs and auxiliary pumps. She had been a flagship once. Now she was a floating coffin. Over the headset came a burst of static, followed by the voice of the air officer, strained and hollow. Strike formation 1 launch. Renji opened the throttle. The engine sputtered, caught, then screamed to life, shaking his entire frame. He released the brake, and the Zero surged forward, clawing down the deck as salt spray lashed across the windshield. The plane lifted into the air, fighting the crosswind and the carrier's slow pitch. As he gained altitude, Renji looked down to see the next aircraft lurching forward, barely airborne before clearing the bow. Climbing to 5,000 feet, he formed up with the scattered remains of his squadron. 10 aircraft in total. 5 Zeros, 3 aging torpedo bombers, and 2 dive bombers. They flew unevenly, drifting slightly in formation engines, coughing fuel lines weeping into the sky. Some of the planes had visible scorch marks, damage from earlier engagements never properly repaired. None of the pilots spoke. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Every man in that formation knew they wouldn't be returning. Strategically, this was madness. The Americans had been spotted by scout aircraft the day before, a massive task force bristling with carriers, destroyers, and cruisers. radar coverage that spanned hundreds of miles, hundreds of aircraft. Layers upon layers of anti-aircraft batteries, proximity-fused shells, fighter screens. And yet this formation was being sent in. Why? Because the High Command needed a diversion. Somewhere south, another Japanese fleet, the Surface Action Group, was trying to break into Leyte Gulf. But to do so, they needed the Americans distracted. Renji's unit was the bait. Their role wasn't to succeed. It was to die, loudly, visibly, and tragically enough to draw American attention northward. Their deaths were the opening move of someone else's strategy. Renji had read the maps. He'd seen the briefings. He knew the logic. It didn't make the reality any less cold. He adjusted his heading. The formation drifted slowly toward the east, toward the known coordinates of the American fleet. Below the ocean shimmered deceptively calm. A soft gray now brushed the eastern sky. He glanced at his fuel gauge. Barely enough for a one-way trip. There would be no return. There would be no rescue. His mind flashed back to the deck of the Amagi, the way the wind had scattered loose paper like falling leaves. The way the mechanic's hands shook as he loaded the final shell. The look in the eyes of the young pilot next to him, not fear, but confusion, as if he still couldn't understand how it had come to this. Renji exhaled slowly, letting that memory burn into his mind. If this was the last flight, it would be burned into more than memory. It would be his body, his aircraft, his final defiance etched in flame. The radio crackled again. Enemy radar contact. Range 140 kilometers. Altitude 24,000 feet. American fighters were already in the air. The Hellcats would be hunting. They had radar direction. They would know exactly where to look. Renji glanced at his instruments. He checked the gun switch, flipped the safety off, and rested his gloved hand on the control stick. He looked ahead. The horizon glowed gold, now the sun bleeding into the clouds. They were still flying toward it, as if chasing light in a world that had gone dark. A faint buzzing grew louder in the distance, not from their engines, but from beyond. The first line of interceptors was coming. The wall of steel was waking up. At 0637 hours, as Renji Sato's formation crossed 30 miles north of Samar, a radar station aboard the USS Essex picked them up. They were still invisible to the naked eye, still just specks of aluminum skimming across the sky at low altitude. But to the American fleet, they were already marked for death. The SCR-720 radar system lit up with a fresh contact, and within seconds, data was flowing across the task force like electricity through wire. Range, altitude, bearing, speed, all calculated, updated in real time, fed into the fire control networks and passed on to the combat air patrol directors. The Americans didn't need to see the incoming raid to know where it was, where it would be, and how to kill it. Renji couldn't know the exact moment they'd been spotted. There were no warnings, no alarms, no visual sign. The sky remained deceptively empty ahead, but in his bones he felt it. The silence had changed. The air around his aircraft seemed heavier, as if the world itself had begun watching. That invisible presence, the sense of being seen without seeing, crept into his chest. He scanned the clouds, above eyes straining for movement, but nothing appeared, nothing except the distant growl of thunder that wasn't thunder at all. It was engines, big ones. Miles away, F-6F Hellcats were already in the air. Directed by fighter controllers aboard the Langley and Franklin, they were being vectored with chilling precision toward the exact altitude and approach angle of the Japanese formation. The Americans had no need for guesswork. Their system was seamless. Eyes in the sky, brains in the ship, claws in the clouds. The Mark 37 directors perched atop cruisers and battleships swiveled in unison, calculating solutions based on radar data and compensating for every roll, pitch, and yaw of the ship beneath them. While Renji and his comrades flew blind, the Americans saw everything. The technology gap was no longer a matter of efficiency. It was existential. Japanese ships still relied on manual optics, hand-cranked rangefinders, and preset mechanical fuses that required guesswork and luck. Their gunners had to see the enemy estimate their path, set the fuse time by hand, and fire with no guarantee. A miss by even a few meters meant total failure. By contrast, The Americans had developed the VT proximity fuse, a marvel of wartime miniaturization and electrical engineering. Each shell carried a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. When it neared a target, it detonated automatically, spraying a lethal halo of shrapnel with pinpoint timing. Renji leveled off at 9,000 feet, still flying in formation, still unable to see anything but sky. But the Americans saw him. One of the destroyers in the outer ring of Task Force 38 was already elevating its guns. The Mark 1 Ampere analog fire control computer was tracking him as a blip, constantly updating solutions and feeding them into the gun mounts. No human was guessing. No gunner was aiming by feel. The decision to fire when, where, and how was already being made by systems too fast and too precise for any man to match. The first proximity-fused shell exploded 700 meters ahead of the formation. It didn't hit anything directly. It didn't have to. The detonation sent a shockwave through the air and a cloud of razor-sharp fragments in every direction. One of the dive bombers jolted mid-air, then burst into flame as its wing folded inward. No one saw where the shell had come from. There was no smoke trail, no muzzle flash visible from this distance, just the sudden, devastating result. Renji blinked. He hadn't even seen the bomber get hit. It was there one moment, gone the next. He gripped the control stick tighter, his breathing shallow. More detonations, now invisible spheres of death ripping the sky apart. Another plane staggered, then nosedived into the ocean, trailing black smoke. The formation tightened instinctively, but that only made them easier targets. American fire control didn't need mistakes, it punished proximity. They were being taken apart from beyond the horizon. He scanned above again, finally there. Tiny dark shapes diving from altitude sun flashing off their wings. Hellcats. The F-6F was a beast-armored cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and that monstrous Pratt & Whitney engine that gave it both speed and brutality. The Zeros in Renji's flight, designed for 1,941's air combat, were no match. Lighter, faster turning, yes, but fragile. One hit in the engine or tank, and it was over. That difference, once manageable in the hands of veteran aces, was now unbridgeable. There were no veterans left. Just boys and ghosts. The first Hellcat attack run came in high and fast, peeling down in perfect discipline. Gunfire erupted. 6 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft firing in synchronized bursts. Tracers laced through the sky like angry red threads. A Zero just behind Renji exploded mid-air, hit in the engine block. The wreckage spiraled into the sea without a sound. He tried to twist away, evading the climb and slash tactics, but it was futile. The Hellcats were playing by a rulebook the Japanese didn't even have access to. The sky was no longer a battlefield, it was a system. Radar acquisition, vectoring control, proximity-fused AA firefighter screens, layered defense. Every inch was covered. Every approach predicted. To Renji, it felt like flying into a machine that existed solely to consume them. As more shells detonated around him, he realized something colder than fear. He hadn't even had a chance to fire his guns. He hadn't even seen a ship yet. No silhouettes on the horizon, no smokestacks, no masts. Only this invisible web that was tearing them down, one by one. The Americans didn't need to see their enemy anymore. They only needed to detect, calculate, and destroy. A proximity burst erupted to his left. The shock jolted his Zero, and his instruments fluttered. Shrapnel had pierced somewhere aft. He corrected wings wobbling and pressed forward. Because there was nothing else to do. Forward was death. Back was abandonment. His aircraft groaned in protest, leaking something from the engine cowling. His goggles fogged with sweat. Somewhere below the clouds, the task force waited, a fortress, not of concrete, but of code, steel, and electric precision. Renji kept flying, but in his mind he had already understood they weren't fighting an enemy. They were flying against the future. The sky was burning now. Renji's Zero shook violently as another proximity-fused shell erupted nearby, sending a burst of shrapnel that shredded the dive bomber flying just ahead. One moment the aircraft was there. The next, it was a cloud of debris, spiraling panels and flame. The pilot's body flung from the cockpit like a rag doll. No impact, No warning, just sudden erasure. It wasn't a dogfight. It wasn't war as he'd trained for it. It was mechanical slaughter. The Hellcats circled above, pulling into wide arcs, diving in waves. The American fighters didn't linger. They attacked with ruthless precision, slashing and loosing fire, climbing out before anyone could react. A Zero on Renji's left banked too late tried to follow one of the attackers. It caught a full burst across its fuselage, tumbled into a spin, and detonated mid-descent. The flame ball hung in the sky like a marker, another soul gone. Renji pulled tighter into formation with the remaining 5 aircraft. The rest were gone. Shot down, exploded, missing. The torpedo bombers had fared worse, too slow, too heavy fat targets under a hailstorm of lead. The 2 surviving bombers now limped along engines, coughing, trailing smoke like funeral banners across the dawn. Below them, the American fleet came into view, vast, ordered, monstrous. Carrier decks shimmering with motion. Cruisers cutting white trails through the ocean. Destroyers flanking the formation like wolves with teeth bared. And everywhere guns, towers of steel bristling with barrels, eyes of radar spinning like glass orbs hungry for contact. From 1,200 feet, Renji saw the flashes before he heard the thunder. The 5-inch dual-purpose guns opened first, mounted in twin turrets along the decks of battleships and cruisers. Mark 37 directors rotated like statues coming alive, tracking the surviving Japanese planes with calm brutality. The sky ahead turned black with smoke puffs, not random, patterned, calculated, placed with mathematical cruelty. Every shell was a proximity-fused weapon, each one exploding within meters of its prey. The lead dive bomber took a direct hit to the nose. The proximity burst, triggering just beneath its cockpit. The aircraft folded in half mid-air. Its bomb separated from the fuselage and plummeted uselessly into the sea. Another Zero was clipped by a near miss, not torn apart but mangled its wing, sheared off at the root. It spiraled, trailing fuel smoke and fire as the pilot ejected far too low to survive. Renji gritted his teeth and dove lower, below 8,000 feet now. The guns kept firing. Beneath him, the 40mm Bofors mounts lit up. Quad-barrel turrets belched fire in staggered bursts. Each shell, a 2-pound killer, fed by 4-round clips at a relentless pace. They didn't aim at him, they aimed ahead of him, knowing where he would be. A torpedo bomber broke formation, veering toward the USS Franklin. It dropped low, hugging the ocean. A perfect run. Renji held his breath. Maybe this one would make it through. But the destroyers barked. 2 screening ships opened up with 5-inch batteries. VT shells tore through the bomber's path. One detonated beneath the fuselage. The plane lifted as if punched from below, then disintegrated. The torpedo dropped prematurely, spiraled uselessly into the waves. No survivors. Now below 4,000 feet, Renji's ears rang from the concussions. His Zero vibrated with stress. Instruments flickered. He saw a Hellcat rising toward him from a low arc. He banked hard, too hard. A stall warning chirped. He corrected, but the maneuver had thrown off his angle. Then came the Bofors wall. Below 3,000 feet, every ship in range opened up. Bofors shells lit the air in staccato bursts, pom-pom-pom-pom. The entire sky ahead flashed orange and gray. It wasn't aimed fire. It was area denial. The Americans weren't trying to shoot down individual planes. They were building kill zones, boxes of death that no aircraft could fly through and live. A Zero to Renji's right was caught in one of those zones. 4 shells burst simultaneously around its cockpit. The explosion didn't shred it. It unmade it. Parts fell in every direction. One of the wings spiraled past Renji's canopy, flapping like a broken flag before disappearing. He held his line. No use dodging now. There was no gap. The fire was everywhere. Behind him, another explosion roared close enough to shake his teeth. His engine coughed, stuttered, caught again. A thin wisp of smoke now curled from his right wing. Hit, but not fatally. Not yet. Down to 1,500 feet. Now the 20mm Oerlikon cannons opened up the final line. These weren't meant to target, they were meant to erase. Streams of tracer fire stitched the sky, bright orange and white crossing in patterns like a steel net, fast, brutal, constant. One of the last dive bombers pushed through nose down toward a cruiser. For a moment, it looked like he might make it. But then the ship's entire starboard side lit up. 20 or more Oerlikons firing in unison. The aircraft vanished behind the curtain of light. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing but falling pieces and a single wheel spinning toward the water. Renji felt the sting in his throat, not fear, not pain, but helplessness. There was no room for willpower here. No valor. No dogfight. No duel. Just slaughter. Systematic. Predictable. Refined. He jerked the stick left as another Hellcat dove across his tail. Tracers whipped past his canopy. He didn't even have time to fire back. Not that it mattered. The Americans were armored. His rounds would bounce. His best shot was just to keep flying, just to see the target, even if only for a second. The task force loomed closer. Renji blinked sweat from his eyes, heart hammering. He had made it through 4 layers of fire barely. But he was alone now. Every other aircraft had vanished. Some exploded. Some shredded midair. Some drowned. And yet the wall kept growing, reshaping itself, finding him. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a process, a system, a machine. And he was inside it. Renji Zero was barely holding together. The airframe groaned with every control input, the right aileron sluggish, barely responsive. Smoke trailed behind him in a thin, ominous ribbon. His oil pressure was dropping fast. Still, he pushed forward, eyes locked on the heart of the American formation, a carrier, her flight deck crawling with motion, her island superstructure, bristling with antennae and fire control systems. It wasn't a target anymore. It was a monument, unreachable, untouchable. But he aimed for it anyway. Not out of hope that was gone, but because it was all he had left. A final act. He pulled the throttle open as far as the engine would allow, the coughing roar in front of him growing weaker with every second. He reached for the trigger. Nothing. Guns silent. Ammunition gone, or the mechanism damaged. It didn't matter. There was no dogfight left to win, no chance of survival, no possibility of altering the outcome. The mission was already dust, the attack, a shattered illusion. But something inside him needed to see it through to complete the gesture, even if meaningless. Then, he saw it. Another Zero, maybe the last besides his own, diving in at a steep angle toward an American cruiser. The pilot held the line through flak and tracer fire, his wings catching bursts of sunlight as he banked into the attack. For a moment, it was almost beautiful, a silhouette of courage drawn against the mouth of hell. Then the cruiser's entire broadside erupted. A wall of 40mm fire caught the plane mid-dive. It didn't explode immediately. It twisted, broke, pieces flying off like leaves in a storm. The wreckage splashed into the sea, short of the ship, a single wheel skipping across the surface before vanishing. Renji didn't blink. He couldn't. His eyes burned not from grief, but from the knowledge that none of it mattered. That pilot had died performing a maneuver no longer relevant in a war that had moved beyond bravery. A proximity burst cracked to his left, sending his aircraft into a brief, uncontrolled roll. He fought the stick back, leveled out, but the Zero was finished. The controls were mush. The engine sputtered, then gave a final mechanical groan. Silence. He was gliding now, dead weight, over an ocean on fire. He looked down. The sea was littered with pieces of men and machines. Black oil slicks stretched like open wounds across the water. Parts of wings floated aimlessly. He caught sight of a body, face down, arms out as if still reaching for the sky. Another, still in its flight harness, bobbed up before sinking beneath a wave. Their names were unknown, faces already fading. His altitude was dropping fast. He scanned for a place to ditch. Smoke trailed behind him like a funeral ribbon. Alarms flickered on his panel, useless now. The American formation filled the horizon. Giant steel behemoths with no emotion, no fear, no vulnerability. Their guns still searched the sky, even as the threat dissolved into memory. Renji pulled back slightly, slowing descent. His canopy jammed halfway as he tried to open it. He used both hands to force it back. Cold air and smoke flooded into the cockpit. He unbuckled, braced. The ocean rushed up to meet him. Impact. Metal screamed. The Zero slammed into the sea, skipped once, then nose down. Water exploded around the wreckage. He was thrown forward violently, his shoulder snapping against the side of the cockpit. For a heartbeat, everything went black. When Renji surfaced, gasping oil stung his eyes and salt burned his throat. The remains of his Zero floated nearby the tail, barely above water, before it too began to sink. He kicked off what was left of his harnessed chest, rising and falling in ragged jerks. Around him nothing but debris and silence. Silence, but not peace. The air was still thick with the echo of gunfire, the rumble of engines fading now, as the task force prepared to move again. The attack was over. The Japanese strike had been annihilated, not broken in combat, but erased by layers of technology that anticipated every move, calculated every angle, and fired before any human saw their enemy. Renji clung to a piece of wreckage, part of a rudder scorched and twisted, and stared upward. A single American plane passed overhead, cruising in lazy circles, now hunting for survivors, but not Japanese ones. He knew no one was coming for him, and in that moment, drifting in blood-warm water beneath a sky he no longer recognized, Renji understood the truth that had been circling his mind since the mission began. Human will, valor, skill, all of it had become irrelevant. The enemy hadn't just fielded better machines. They had rewritten the rules. They saw in the dark. They struck from beyond sight. They built a wall of steel and fire that even ghosts couldn't pass through. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, not to surrender, but because there was nothing left to see. The ocean was a graveyard. Renji drifted through the wreckage, clutching a piece of torn metal, the last remnant of his aircraft. The water around him was black with oil glinting faintly in the light of distant fires. The sky above was gray and indifferent, smeared with smoke from burning ships and fuel slicks. Pieces of fuselage bobbed around him like the bones of some colossal creature torn apart by invisible teeth. The sound that filled the world was no longer battle, it was aftermath. Distant thunder rolled across the horizon where the American task force steamed south, engines humming with mechanical certainty, leaving behind nothing but ruin. He could still see them in the distance, tiny silhouettes of carriers, cruisers, destroyers moving in perfect formation, their decks calm, their systems untouched. The wall of steel that had devoured his comrades now moved on, unstoppable, efficient, alive, in a way only machines could be. Each radar, pulse, each firing, command, each mechanical movement had worked together in harmony, erasing an entire air group in less than an hour. No hesitation, no mercy, no need for human instinct. Renji floated among the dead. A body drifted past, face half-burned, eyes open. The insignia on the tattered flight uniform was familiar, one of his wingmen. He reached out, fingers brushing the fabric, but the corpse slipped away into the current. The sea didn't care. It carried them all the same way, heroes and failures alike. He thought about the mission briefing that morning, the words of the officer who had said, "Even a failed strike can change the course of battle." Now, looking around, he understood how hollow that had been. The course of battle had already been written by equations, by circuits, by machines calculating faster than any human could think. Above the distant horizon, the last of the Japanese carriers was burning. Renji could make out its listing shape, the Amagi smoke, pouring from her hull, explosions walking across the deck as American dive bombers circled like vultures. He knew what that meant. There would be no homecoming, no rescue, no return to base. The fleet was gone. The Empire's last illusion of power was dissolving in the flames before his eyes. He was witnessing the end of everything he had been taught to believe in: the samurai spirit, the invincibility of will, the idea that courage could shape fate. The Americans had changed the very nature of warfare. They fought with integration, with systems, with machines that thought for them. Their ships didn't just shoot, they calculated. Their gunners didn't aim, they executed data. Every movement was linked, every sensor feeding into a network that decided who lived and who died before a human even saw his enemy. War had become a formula, and Renji's side had never even known the problem. A wave lifted him, carried him higher for a moment, and he caught sight of more wreckage. A float plane upside down, its pilot still strapped inside, a broken propeller glinting beneath the surface. A life raft drifting far off, too distant to reach. He wanted to call out, but his voice was gone. His throat ached with salt and smoke. He realized he hadn't spoken a word since takeoff. There had been no one left to speak to. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a deep rumble echoed the sound of an explosion aboard one of the last Japanese escorts. A bright flash lit the horizon, followed by a rising column of black. The Amagi was gone. That final realization hit him harder than fear ever could. The last carrier he had ever served on was sinking, her crew still aboard her flag, soon to vanish beneath the waves. The sound of men screaming was carried faintly by the wind, then swallowed by the sea. Renji stared at the horizon where the American fleet had disappeared, his vision blurred by exhaustion and disbelief. They were already preparing for their next strike, for the next battle, for the next target. Their systems would reload, recalibrate, and move forward without pause. Humans were only one part of the process, now replaceable, secondary, even unnecessary. He thought of the young pilot he'd seen that morning, trembling as he climbed into his cockpit. He was dead now. Everyone was. And for what? To delay an enemy that no longer fought as men, but as machines bound by logic and precision. He let his head fall back into the water, eyes toward the sky. The clouds above were streaked with contrails and drifting ash. Somewhere up there, the Americans still flew methodical as ever, following vector lines and radar blips, instead of instinct or fear. That was their advantage. That was their revolution. They had turned the chaos of war into numbers, and those numbers had crushed him, his comrades, and everything his country had believed in. The current carried him slowly away from the burning wreckage. The water grew quieter. His mind drifted between numbness and clarity. He could feel his body growing heavy, his limbs weaker, the cold pressing in. But his thoughts burned sharper than ever. It wasn't just defeat, it was revelation. The age of heroes was over. The battlefield no longer belonged to men with courage in their hearts. It belonged to circuits, to computation, to the invisible hand of science. For a long time, he floated in silence. The sea hissed softly against bits of twisted metal. Somewhere, a bird called its voice, lost in the wind. The last sound of life in a world built for death. Renji closed his eyes. In his mind, he could still hear the roar of engines, the scream of shells, the crackling radio orders that sent him into the sky. But beneath all that noise was something deeper, the hum of the system that had replaced them. A sound, too perfect, too cold, too final. If anyone ever found him, if anyone ever asked what had happened that morning, he knew what he would say. We weren't defeated because we lacked courage. We were defeated because we didn't understand that courage no longer mattered. The war had outgrown us. The century had begun without us. The sky over the Pacific that morning was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror held up to the future. What unfolded above those steel ships and oil-slick waters was not a clash between pilots, but between centuries. On one side flew men of flesh and spirit, trained in courage, driven by duty. On the other stood machines of logic and precision, guided by systems that saw what men could not struck before human eyes, could focus, and killed with mathematical certainty. Renji Sato's journey through fire, through loss, through the silence that followed, was not only the story of a failed mission, it was the death of an era. The last Zero that flew over Task Force 38 didn't fall because the pilot flinched. It fell because war had evolved past the reach of bravery. Technology had rewritten the rules. Proximity fuses replaced instincts. Radar outthought experience. Integrated systems turned every battle into a formula, and every pilot into a data point. We must not forget this. In every age, there comes a moment when the tools we create surpass the hands that built them. That moment demands humility, reflection, and readiness to adapt. If we cling to old doctrines in the face of new realities, we will be swept away, just as the Imperial Air Group was, wave by wave, into fire and sea. So, remember the silence that followed. Remember the wreckage, the unmarked graves, the men who flew, knowing they could not return. And let their story be more than a eulogy. Let it be a warning when courage is no longer enough. It is our responsibility to change or be destroyed by the systems we fail to understand.